dia do nosso Congresso Latino-Americano de Satélites, mas em tese hoje é o primeiro. Ontem foi um pré-evento. Mas já deu dessa brincadeira, né? Hoje é o nosso segundo dia, dá para a gente dizer que o evento já tem 3 dias. Então, já estamos devidamente consolidados, se bem que agora é a nossa a abertura oficial, vamos dizer assim. A gente começa os trabalhos trazendo os painéis principais, as discussões mais aprofundadas e os temas que são os temas de interesse mais geral. Ontem a gente estava mais focado em questões de políticas públicas e aspectos regulatórios. Para aqueles que não me conhecem, eu sou Samuel Possebon, editor da Teletime, organizador desse evento, juntamente com o Rubens Glasberg, que está aqui, que é o fundador da Teletime, o fundador desse evento, criador desse evento, e que até hoje permanece liderando aí esse evento, que é referência no mercado de satélites brasileiro, latino-americano, já há mais de 20 anos. Eu já perdi a conta, Rubens, de quanto que a gente está aqui no nosso Congresso de Satélites. A gente parou de botar o número, mas já deu aí, com certeza, pelo menos um ciclo de vida útil de um bom satélite, a gente já conseguiu cumprir. A gente fica muito feliz de, mais uma vez, poder organizar esse encontro aqui com vocês. E a gente vai ter, nesses próximos 2 dias, uma programação muito rica e muito detalhada, com algumas novidades em relação ao modelo que a gente praticava nos anos anteriores, atendendo um pouco a uma demanda de vocês, também para a gente possibilitar uma oxigenação maior em alguns temas que a gente trata no evento. Então, o que a gente vai ver nos próximos 2 dias são os painéis e as discussões que, tradicionalmente, o Congresso Latino-Americano de Satélites propicia, trazendo tendências, trazendo a visão das principais lideranças da indústria, abordando alguns segmentos importantes de mercado. E a gente vai ter também um pouco mais de aprofundamento em algumas verticais que estão começando a se desenvolver ou verticais que já são consolidadas no mercado de satélites. Especificamente esse ano, a gente traz debates sobre temas interessantes, como, por exemplo, infraestrutura e redes neutras, que é um tema que a gente nunca havia explorado nesse encontro. A gente vai ter discussões sobre cloud, que é um tema que já, desde da época da pandemia, a gente está trazendo, porque ele é muito relevante para o mercado de satélites, como potencial de desenvolvimento. A gente vai falar um pouco sobre conectividade significativa, que já foi um tema que foi abordado ontem, mas de maneira um pouco mais aprofundada. Vamos falar um pouco, faz tempo que a gente não fala do mercado marítimo, né? Óleo e gás e mercado marítimo, então a gente vai ter um debate sobre isso. Vamos falar sobre redes privativas, que também é um tema novo dentro do universo de discussões que a gente promove aqui. Então, o evento está com essas características um pouco diferentes, com essas sessões que vão acontecer hoje na parte da tarde e amanhã, principalmente na parte da tarde. Vocês vão notar que são sessões mais curtas, com uma quantidade menor de participantes, mas para a gente poder focar um pouco mais num tema específico, né, e trazer essa oxigenação, como eu coloquei, em relação ao que a gente trata nos principais painéis, que são temas um pouco mais amplos, com uma discussão um pouco mais aberta e contemplando aí diferentes aspectos. Nesse primeiro painel que a gente vai ter agora, a gente vai falar um pouco sobre as transformações no mercado de satélites ou de conectividade envolvendo coisas que voam, vamos dizer assim, na falta de uma definição melhor, porque também a gente vai ter uma apresentação sobre RAPS, que é uma tecnologia nova de conectividade com veículos de alta altitude, e que não é exatamente satélites, mas tem um pouco a ver com o nosso universo aqui, porque entra mais ou menos no mesmo espectro de serviços que podem ser prestados. Mas antes disso, antes da gente entrar nesse painel especificamente, em que a gente vai ter essas apresentações, a gente tem um convidado especial. Quem vai participar agora do evento com vocês é o Amit Somani, ele é CEO da ABS, uma das operadoras de satélite que participa já tradicionalmente desse evento, e o Amit veio ao Brasil e vai fazer essa apresentação inicial, essa apresentação inaugural do evento. Então, Amit, eu agradeço a sua presença aqui, te convido ao palco, ele vai fazer a apresentação em inglês, apesar de falar um português excelente. Peço uma salva de palmas para o Amit.
Bom dia, desculpa, vou falar em inglês, mas posso, pode ter perguntas em português depois, mais fácil para mim. Ok, agora. So, good morning, everyone. Hope you've had your coffee. Look, I have a bit of a history in Brazil. You may have met me in the past. It's good to see many old friends. When I was actually with Yasat, I was standing here about 8 years ago talking about KA band, and here I am 8 years later now, a year into my role at ABS, with a slightly different challenge, but still the same fundamental challenge in terms of making sure that we connect the unconnected in all our markets and our important markets, including Brazil. So we have this theme that we say, look, we're quite lonely as a small satellite operator and as an independent one. There are many operators in the world who you probably know are small, relatively small, but they tend to have some sort of group around them. ABS is quite unique, and there's a question that we always ask, what should we do for the future? Should we scale up, or should we remain agile and really focus on what we do best? And that's a bit of the theme of the presentation you'll see. So just to give you some history, the journey, we call it the brand journey, but actually it's just the journey of ABS. It started in 2006 with a satellite which was an older satellite bought by one of the founders of the company. From that, over the next 15 or 16 years, it evolved into a global operator, having 5 satellites, across everything from Brazil, you'll see the coverage on the next slide, from Brazil all the way through Africa, EMEA, India, Asia, and then the Pacific. Now, as a satellite operator with 5 satellites, it's quite an achievement to have that coverage. But again, we are relatively small compared to the bigger players out there. Unfortunately, and fortunately for me, I guess, we have a new chapter. But over the years, it came across some of the same headwinds that you would have seen in the industry. The price is changing, demand changing, the use case is changing for the capacity that's already up there. It did have to go through a financial restructuring, whereby the old shareholders' private equity firm was taken out and 3 new shareholders came in with a new balance sheet, restructured balance sheet, new management and a new chapter for the company, which I think is really quite refreshing now. We can actually do what we do best versus focusing on repaying debts, which was the focus in the last few years before I joined. So today we're a global operator. We're empowering capacity, businesses, governments, communities, broadcasters, a slew of use cases right across the globe, which we'll talk about a little bit. Okay, this is our coverage. Some of you may have seen this already. As I mentioned, everything across the continent. The only place we don't cover, but where we do have a strong business, is US, or CONUS, continental US. We don't have coverage there, but we have a lot of customers there. Clearly, a lot of the service providers, as well as the US government, is a key consumer of our capacity. So covering all the band C, KU, KA, and actually we also have some legacy S-band, which was a bit of a legacy from one of the Korea-Japan mobile radio efforts, which ended up in our portfolio. This is why you see the S-band. Okay, but we do cover 93% of the world's population, so we're global as far as we're concerned. Okay, so what's happening in the industry? The landscape is shifting clearly for GEO operators. I've had a challenge how long it would take before I mention the word Starlink, so I'm going to mention it now. Starlink is disrupting us all. There's no denial, but really it's a disruption of many forms, not just Starlink. But look, what does that result in? A KU-FSS demand, in our view, there are opportunities. It remains relatively strong, especially for traditional applications. We are seeing some balancing of those across different technologies, but certainly we see that as a sort of a mainstay for GEO. We do see several markets still growing, in fact. I think there's this tendency to say, well, everything's shrinking. No, we see growth in GEO, in FSS, in Africa, in certain parts of LATAM, in Brazil we see opportunities, as well as across Asia. I think we're seeing a resurgence of demand, partly driven by some of the USO programs as well, which we'll see shortly. Government is always someone who we've always found relies or prefers to rely on GEO. I came from a company where 80% of the revenues were were from a government. In fact, they've just ordered 2 new satellites just to demonstrate, again, that they will stay on GEO. Sovereignty is key, and if not sovereignty, just control over your network. And I think GEO offers that capability. Universal service obligations clearly, I think, are now finally kicking in. I think Brazil is actually a role model. I'll talk about that, but we're seeing that kick in many of our markets where the governments are finally stepping up and saying, you've got to finish the job, you've got to connect everyone. And again, you cannot do that without satellite, and you cannot do that without GEO. Larger operators, what we're seeing is whilst they're pivoting, and I say larger, SES, Intelsat, the Eutelsat, etc., and not just those, but others as well, perhaps larger than us, they're actually pivoting their strategies. They're stopping new investments to a great extent in GEO and creating new sort of paths, if you like, on the strategic side, whether it be LEO, whether it be applications. And while they're doing that, they're just minimizing their capex. And that's an opportunity for us. So we're finding increasingly that our revenues are coming from other operators, which if you go back 10 years, it was unheard of. You'd never sell to your competitor. Nowadays, everyone needs to collaborate. And I think that's a great efficiency which needs to kick in the market. Of course, the challenges, and again, Starlink will appear here, but video demand is declining. Look, there are still some cash cows out there, unfortunately not something we can rely on going forward, but we have to adapt our capacity. We'll talk about that a little bit. C-band is generally slowing, but a lot of that is to do with, I guess, just the shift towards 5G. But it's still, there is whilst it's there, it's the most reliable GEO capacity out there. It may not be the throughput, but certainly from a wideband perspective, resilience, et cetera, you get a unique product. So we still see that, somewhat stable, but inevitably it is on the decline. HTS generally, because of the performance and the throughput, is disrupting us on the GEO market where we don't have HTS as ABS. And I mentioned Starlink and NGSO, so they're disrupting the market heavily. In fact, there have been cases where, and I think maybe you'll start to see those here, where the requirements came in for a GEO FSS capacity, and then we were undercut by actually 90% by Starlink. And when you have a customer who's actually a cellular backhaul customer saying, well, let me give it a try, there's not much you can do, right? So I think what will happen is certainly that will also disrupt the traditional markets, but then I do believe that there'll be a sort of a settling point where everyone finds their niche and does what they do best, and the customers start to realize that. What we're also seeing, though, is a bit of client paralysis, or say paralysis, deal pace or deal tenure is shortening, because there are a lot of customers are saying, well, I don't know what's going to be there a year from now, because the pace of the market is moving, or the industry is moving so quickly. And again, that just creates new challenges, and we just have to remain more agile, more flexible to accommodate those. But look, overall, the industry growth is muted, and I think we need to find ways, especially as a smaller operator, to overcome those, not stick with the traditional business model. So the question is, how do we adapt? So we came up with, a year ago, with a strategy which really said, look, there's ways you can adapt by throwing more money and investing more and trying to build up scale, or we can try and make good of what we have and create a more efficient business and a more efficient industry. And this is what we're focusing on. So I mentioned geo-operator collaboration. That's something which I'd like to see more and more, because it creates new efficiencies in the industry. There's no point having 50% fill rates and then competing with each other. We might as well make use of that and make the future capex investments more efficient. And we see that from time to time with condosats, et cetera. But what I'm saying here is, as an industry, let's use the capacity we have up there rather than create new inefficiencies and financial pressures. Let's all work together so that we provide the customer the best possible value proposition at the best profitability, inevitably for us as well. Then we have, as a smaller company, we realized, and I've got a slide to demonstrate this a bit more, white label. What we call white label is where we, as a smaller operator, it doesn't make sense for us to build the value chain. It becomes inefficient. We'd have to invest in OPEX, we'd have to invest in CAPEX, and it just starts to become an inefficient model unless we had the scale. But we do see opportunities where there are other players in the value chain who are also similar, where they haven't gone upstream or downstream, and there's ways to partner in new business models to benefit from those. Government and defense, I mentioned already. That's, again, we're seeing a resurgence, especially on the US side, in the APAC region, the Asia Pacific region, but certainly in many of our regions, so that remains a strategic focus for us. And the last one is where we call repurposing our capacity. Now, I mentioned on the last slide, a lot of the video demand is declining. And with that, the BSS capacity, especially the 17 to 18 gigahertz, it was designed for video distribution. And the terminals out there and the regulation out there was designed for video distribution, DTH, direct to home, etc. Now, what's happening is that capacity is over time sitting idle. Again, it would be a shame not to use that. And the only thing really preventing us from using that is the technology in terms of the terminals as well as the regulation. So we're ourselves pursuing new technology development with a partner where we're developing terminals, two-way terminals to work in the 17 to 18 gigahertz band, and then working with regulators where needed to ensure that we can actually use that instead of for video, for data, so that the efficiency, again, of the capacity out there can be maximized. And we're seeing that in Indonesia. Actually, the regulator recently went out of the way and they made a new regulation saying you can use that band for two-way. In other markets, they remain silent. In some markets, unfortunately, like Malaysia, they tend to prevent it because there's just, let's say, some national interest they're trying to protect. But certainly we're seeing a trend towards supporting this, and I think that could be quite useful also in Brazil in due course as well. Just mention one last thing as well, the hybrid. I'm not sure if you can see the bottom of the screen, but hybrid NGSO partnerships. I think we need to be very measured in terms of how we work together with the LEO operators. We see use cases, again, where the efficiency of bringing a broadcast or a wide beam capacity with a very dedicated IP connection to every user. You know, there are many use cases out there. The use cases we can think of and we're pursuing and we're trialing, we'll hopefully setting up trials in the coming year or so. For example, distance learning. Now, if you think a case where you've got X number of schools, 100 schools, they've all got their LEO terminal, whether it's Starlink or OneWeb, etc. Now, certainly they'll be all having an internet connection and they're downloading and uploading, you know, based on sort of non-linear, if you like, usage. But a lot of the content that they're receiving for distance learning is the same lesson that's being given to the entire country. It's just being broadcast. So let's save the I guess, more valuable IP connection for the internet connection, and let's overlay that, or do network offloading effectively, which we see in the mobile world, onto GEO. And these are use cases, I think, which will start to make sense for all of us, because if not, we'll start to also reach saturation in terms of spectrum on the NGSOs. I mentioned this white label, but just wanted to visualize this a bit more. What we see is a lot of the players, whether they're national players or they're service providers, international players, they've all started off at different points in the value chain. What we see also is they've all taken the approach of scaling up to a great extent, which has perhaps worked well for them, but certainly for us, it was a little bit out of reach. If you take an example of my old company like Yasat, they started off doing managed services or consumer services, but they realized they should go upstream and start selling more megahertz into the market. So they kind of went into a more traditional GEO model. Other national champions like Miasat or Asailsat, they have a captive market. They can focus on that. They can essentially lock in the business they need downstream. The bigger operators, SES, Intelsat, Eutelsat, etc., they all have managed services now. They compete with those customers, the SPs, whether it's Speedcast or Marlink, they're actually competing with those now, and they've built out the networks, which I think it makes sense for them, because there's, you know, the capacity is over time becoming commoditized, and where does the value lie? It's further down the value chain. Enterprise, traditional players like Hughes and Viasat, we've seen certainly they've gone towards consumer, but now they've also started building their own satellites. They've got the scale and they've got the breadth across the value chain. And then we've seen also the bigger players, or what were the dominant players in the SPs, they've started to consolidate. So Speedcast is a perfect example, which has bought a number of companies over the years and has become, if you like, a dominant force in the service provider or system integrator part of the value chain. What we then see is the smaller players who've chosen to remain smaller over time. ABS from the satellite capacity side, but also on the SPs. Those SPs, such as in our markets, we have ISAT in Africa, specialized SP, or we have Gilat Telecom, Network Innovations also from Canada. they're all generally quite specialized. They're very good at what they do, but they don't have the scale. And what we found is a new business model where we can white label. Effectively, we partner with a new commercial model where they take less risk, but they have the product ready available. Typically, an SP would have bought the capacity, taken the risk, or would be very reactive. When the demand comes in, they go out to the market. What we've got is a model which we can elaborate on during the day if anyone is interested, is a model where we actually have a commercial agreement ahead of time. We're ready with the capacity. It's managed, it's MBPS, and effectively becomes an easier go-to-market model with a revenue share instead of a very traditional tactical way of approaching things. So that brings the scale through collaboration. You don't need to necessarily build it yourself. And I think, again, it's all about that agility and that efficiency that we look for. And in fact, that's something we want to bring to Brazil. We do believe that lighting up our capacity in this way with partners could be good for all of us, including the market and our customers. Now, what we see is a significant opportunity in some key markets. Now, I've mentioned 4 markets. Clearly, we have far more than this, but these are the ones we tend to spend a lot of time on: India, Indonesia, Philippines, and Brazil. Now, India is, you may be following it, they've just changed their regulation. They finally have opened up a new space policy which allows foreign operators to come in without having to go through ISRO or their space agency or their, what used to be Antrix, which was their authorized government importer of capacity. They're opening up. I think they're far behind, but certainly it's great to see such a large market taking a positive step towards making it a better market for satellite operators, but also for the enterprises, the telecom operators and the consumers that need the capacity. They're begging for capacity in India, and we have capacity. It's just a matter of time before now we can get through this regulation. Indonesia, we've seen actually take some pretty positive steps in recent years. They've employed a PPP, or public-private partnership model, stimulated by government demand with capacity commitments, commitments for connectivity for the underserved, essentially for USO, universal service obligations. And we've seen them make big strides. They've launched 2 satellites. They were planning to launch another one. It's slightly on hold. But certainly they're taking the lead now and bringing in capacity in an efficient way through partnership. Philippines is a key market for us. We actually have half of our company, for those that don't know. We have around 70 people there. We bought the national operator, Mabuhay, about 12 years ago and integrated that into ABS. The Philippines is now realizing it also needs to take steps. Again, a large population, 150 odd million people. They need to take steps quickly to connect the unconnected. A lot of islands, a lot of places that need connectivity. They're again taking a rapid approach to employ private sector to support their national programs. They're slightly behind. They haven't perhaps been as quick off the mark as Indonesia, but certainly we're seeing a lot of activity there. And then there's Brazil. Now, Brazil, I've experienced the last 10 to 12 years of this industry evolving. It actually has become the role model. When I go to these markets and I talk to the regulators and they say, how should we do, how should we connect the unconnected? Should we buy capacity? Should we import it? Should we do PPPs? Well, actually, Brazil is now, the reference point, if you like. Well, if you follow, certain best practices, you can actually get to a point where the market has gone from what is restricted in the national industry, which was important, in the initial stages, to controlled import, to actually a very efficient model where now the private sector is taking the lead, through incentives, through rules, if you like the 5G auctions. But they're actually engaged now and they're completing the job. And that's something quite unique. If I go to India today, they're still, to be honest, having a discussion around whether or not satellite spectrum should be auctioned off to terrestrial operators. Again, I see something in Brazil where that was very clear for many years now. And whilst there was the foreign versus international operator model, over time that's now become far more, if you like, standard in terms of open skies. It was always a very structured approach to ensuring the satellite industry was protected, was aided, and was contributing towards the connectivity needs of the country. And I think, again, it's important to appreciate the steps and the progress that Brazil has made to become the role model for many countries, not just these across the globe, in terms of how to effectively implement a USO program and engage the satellite industry. And again, I think you all know this, but certainly the USO opportunity, thanks to the structure around it and the the auctions all having these requirements for the operators to complete the job in terms of connectivity. That's helped complete the connectivity needs, but also requires satellite. So we look at around 7,000 locations which need to be upgraded in this next tranche. About 80%, I understand, around 6,000 of those will need satellite capacity. Now, if you took 8 forward, 4 return, that would give you a few hundred, or maybe roughly around 100 Gbps. But reality is you're going to need a lot more than that. So you're talking hundreds of Gbps of capacity. We're going to have to work together. There's going to be C-band that's going to be providing resilience in some cases. You'll have KU and KA-HTS where that works, where there's concentration. Performance is important in terms of throughput. And then the NGSOs, even if they don't offer SLAs or CIR committed rates, they can still play a big role. And I think it's important that we all, again, when I talk about the efficiency and the collaboration that's needed, rather than say we're all working against each other to complete this job, I think there's a way that we can all ensure that this job gets completed and the industry doesn't suffer. And importantly, we're not necessarily destroying value through this process. The feeling is that all the capacity in the skies will end up getting used. I mean, that would be a nice problem to have, but certainly we've got to make sure that we don't use it inefficiently. Again, ABS has capacity to support that. And last but not least, I mentioned the new chapter. Some people may have an understanding of ABS standing for Asia Broadcast Satellite, etc. Certainly those were the foundations, but as you can see, the company has evolved from that to something entirely different. Okay, so we tried to come up with something where we didn't lose the name of the legacy, but we wanted to make sure that people know we are a different company now. So we came up with this new logo. It's coming out next month, but you get a preview. Agility beyond space, okay? And why is that? Look, we are agile. I mentioned that. We have to remain agile. We are one of probably the most flexible and, I guess, responsive companies out there. This is the comment I always get. And beyond space, we don't just provide satellite infrastructure. We provide services, solutions. We will work beyond just providing the capacity. So again, this is something you'll see more of going forward, and the values which I think just focus us on what we do best. And really, focus is important. I mentioned agile a lot, but focus. We're very careful not to pretend to do what we are not good at. What we're good at, we'll do it the best we can, and hopefully that will serve the needs of our customers and help us all to succeed. Thank you.
Acho que o Rubens dispensa apresentação. Rubens Glasberg é o nosso coordenador geral desse evento e, além de estar aqui conosco para essa abertura, eu vou passar para o Rubens a chance de começar a fazer uma rodada de perguntas e respostas com a Amit, que participou conosco. Rubens, o microfone já está funcionando, te passo a palavra.
Estão me ouvindo?
Sim, pode falar.
Bom, antes de mais nada, quero cumprimentar a todos e dizer que esse é um começo de uma nova forma de nós montarmos esse evento. Tá? Nós estamos num momento, numa fase, que ouvimos a sua palestra, uma fase disruptiva do setor de satélites, e eu acredito que esses momentos disruptivos, em vez de mexem com tudo, mas são grandes oportunidades, certo? São oportunidades de você entrar, por exemplo, como país, inclusive, aproveitar um momento de transformação para entrar num processo. E eu fiquei ontem muito feliz, porque eu vi que, por 2 palestras ontem, do Coronel Moura e do Major Juliano, que o Brasil está pensando em aproveitar esse embalo e entrar também, dentro dos seus limites, mas com possibilidades de participar dessa mudança que nós estamos tendo aqui, agora, no mercado de satélites. Tá? Outra coisa que esse evento de ontem, em que nós dedicamos uma parte à regulamentação e mercado de governo, nós pensávamos que era uma coisa pequena, que estávamos contando no início com 40 pessoas só, numa salinha, e veio todo mundo. Então, o que fica claro, certo, é que o problema essa disrupção não é só um problema para nós aqui brasileiros, certo? É um problema em termos de regulamentação, é um problema que se estende a demais países. Eu chego muitas vezes a afirmar que nós, no campo do espaço, nós vamos precisar de de um novo tratado de Tordesilhas, como no século XV, ou, o Congresso de Viena, no século XIX, para uma divisão do espaço. Meu pedaço é aqui, o seu pedaço é ali, não pode ficar essa bagunça que está hoje. E, enfim, desejo a todos um bom congresso e passo a palavra aí para o Samuca para começar.
Eu acho que o ponto... Amit, eu posso fazer a pergunta em português para você? Então, ele fala perfeito português, tá? É só uma questão de preciosismo dele aqui, não querer fazer a palestra em português. Mas um ponto importante da sua apresentação é que você traz a necessidade de que a indústria hoje parta para um modelo de parcerias e de colaboração entre os diferentes players da indústria, especialmente dos players que têm uma atuação mais limitada, dos players menores. O Brasil tem operadores de satélite nessa condição, mas é difícil a gente construir essas parcerias. Eu acho que existe o desafio, primeiro, da parceria ser construída, e depois todo o desafio tecnológico de integração e de fazer com que isso não seja só uma parceria de um revender a capacidade do outro, mas de fazer tudo funcionar dentro de um ecossistema. Até que ponto você vê esse modelo de parcerias evoluindo no momento em que a gente está hoje?
Look, I think certainly it's not easy because we're used to the old way of doing things. But the reality is, in order to find these new partnerships, everyone has to take some risk, okay? It cannot be, a risk-free approach. We have to take some risk, but at the same time, by taking that risk, we're reducing risk across the board. Why I say that, let's take an example. In the event an SP or a system integrator who is providing the services, they've got their platform, okay, they've invested in that. But when they need the capacity, they'll come to the market at that point in time. And what you see is that there is the capacity may not be available, the price might not be what they're looking for, etc. So it could create actually an inefficiency, but in their view, it's taking the risk away because they're not spending when they don't need to before the customer is there. The reality is a very simple approach is that let us provide that capacity. It's there, it's already dedicated, but it is not being charged for. Now, what does that do? With a model that we can put in place where the prices are predefined, they're not fixed, but they're predefined, there are guidelines, where there is a somewhat guarantee the capacity is there. It allows them to go to the market with knowledge that the product is there, the price is agreed. So they go to the market, then they fulfill the product versus then start looking for capacity. So what I'm saying is it's very simple, it's not revolutionary, but what it does for us is we don't have to invest in order for us to be able to, we call it white label, by the way, I should mention, because we white label managed services using their capabilities, and we share revenues. If they sell, they take a larger rev share. If we sell, we take a larger rev share. But what it does is it creates a product which previously didn't exist purely because people didn't want to take the risk. Now, in this model, there's a little bit of risk, but the rewards can be much bigger. So I think it's a question of being comfortable to change our mindset, realize that if we don't, then all the other players out there are going to eat us for lunch, right? And take those steps. But it's not just to survive. I think there is a stronger value proposition, and we all exist as smaller players because there's a unique value proposition. Those service providers which are smaller are they're very unique in what they do in terms of the value add, okay? So I think it's important that we don't lose that, but we need to ensure that remains in a sustainable model where the economics are better. So certainly I appreciate it's a model which will require a little bit of discomfort, but at the end of the day, I think it can help us all.
Outro ponto para a gente encerrar essa rodada com o Amit e partir para o próximo painel, mas que eu gostaria que você mencionasse, Amit, você colocou em vários momentos da sua apresentação a variável geopolítica, né? Do ponto de vista de operador, você tem que se manter neutro, mas, ao mesmo tempo, você não pode ser um operador que tenha, por exemplo, problemas com o governo norte-americano, porque isso vai criar dificuldades. Por outro lado, você tem que negociar com governos, você precisa ter uma relação com governos, você depende de muitas questões regulatórias, mencionou o caso da Índia, por exemplo, que agora que abriu o mercado. Como que essa variável geopolítica tem sido hoje determinante para o mercado de satélites?
Look, I think the reality is there are very, let's say, stringent rules in place, okay? So in terms of ITAR, International Trade and Arms Regulations, which will prevent us from having shareholdings from certain countries, but also to do business with certain places. That's a rule that's placed upon us, so that we have to abide by, otherwise we cannot exist. In terms of then ensuring that we always do business as per the applicable laws, I think that's something which we always have to respect, and we have to respect everywhere we operate. I think the important part, though, is to, and we mentioned the word neutral there, we are very neutral, and I think that's something which is very unique. We don't take a political stance. We have no reason to, as ABS. We have US shareholders, fine, that's just the financial sponsorship. But as a company and as a principle, we have no one pulling strings which are in the interest of a nation, a specific nation or a specific agenda. And that actually makes us very, again, agile and flexible to serve government needs. But also importantly, the way we're organized as a company, we're now based in Dubai, okay, that's the HQ, where we have access to a lot of our markets, nearby, but also it's very international. But also as a company, you'll see a very diverse mix of people. And again, this is all to make sure that we have the ability to overcome any barriers to building relationships with nations there. But again, I think it's actually quite a unique part of what we do, and a unique part of our brand, that we are neutral and we will help national agendas as and when we can.
Perfeito. Eu gostaria de agradecer a sua presença aqui, Amit, vindo ao Brasil para abrir esse evento. Te desejo sorte nessa nova fase da ABS, agora já com o novo logo oficialmente lançado no nosso evento. Peço uma salva de palmas para o Amit, então.